In the snow-blanketed village of Wraith Hollow, Christmas was always a quiet affair. It wasn't for lack of cheer or celebration, it was because of the bells. Every year on Christmas Eve at the stroke of midnight, an eerie chime echoed through the frozen forest surrounding the village. No one knew where the sound came from, and no one dared to follow it. The older villagers whispered that the bells belonged to her. They never dared speak her name, but everyone knew the legend of the Yule Bride, a spirit in a tattered white gown who wandered the woods, luring the curious and the foolish to their doom. Her presence was always marked by the soft ringing of bells. But superstition meant little to 12-year-old Thomas Whitaker. He and his family had moved to Wraith Hollow just weeks before Christmas. Thomas was bold for his age, and when his father told him the tale of the bells at dinner, he scoffed. "Thomas, it's just a story. Ghosts aren't real." His father shrugged. Thomas's father, "Then stay inside tomorrow night. Humor the old legends." Christmas Eve arrived, cold and unforgiving. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, burying the village under an unblemished white. The Whitakers celebrated with a warm meal, presents, and the glow of a fire. But as the night crept on, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the bells. His father's warning felt like a challenge, and Thomas was never one to back down. By 11:30 the house was silent. Thomas bundled himself in his coat, slipped his boots on, and snuck outside. The cold hit him like a punch to the chest, but his excitement carried him forward. The village slept soundly as Thomas trudged through the snow toward the edge of the forest. He could already feel the trees watching him. They loomed in the moonlight, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Then it happened. Ding, ding, ding. The bells. Soft at first, like a distant chime, but growing clearer. The sound carried through the trees, delicate and haunting. Thomas froze, his breath frosting in the still air. The bells rang with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and there, deeper in the woods, he saw it. A faint light. Thomas's heart quickened. It wasn't the warm yellow of a lantern, but pale and cold, almost silver. The bells grew louder as the light flickered, beckoning him. Against every instinct, Thomas stepped forward. The snow swallowed his footsteps, the bells growing louder with every step. The forest seemed to close in around him, and the deeper he walked, the stranger it became. The ground beneath the snow turned slick and dark, and the trees no longer looked like trees. They were twisted and warped, their bark writhing as if alive. "Thomas. Just a story," Thomas whispered to himself, his voice trembling. Suddenly the light disappeared. The bells stopped. Thomas turned in every direction. The forest was silent, suffocatingly so. He took a shaky breath and turned back the way he came, but the path was gone. The snow was untouched, as if no one had ever walked there. Then he heard it, the faintest sound of a woman weeping. Thomas spun around and saw her. She stood in the clearing, her gown as white as the snow, her veil tattered and flowing like smoke. Beneath it her face was pale and skeletal, her hollow eye sockets locked on him. In her hand she held an old iron bell, its surface blackened and rusted. "Thomas, hello?" Thomas choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The Yule Bride raised the bell and rang at once. Ding! Thomas's vision blurred. He fell to his knees, clutching his ears. The chime reverberated in his skull, a sound that carried with it an overwhelming weight, sorrow, loss, and something darker. The bride stepped closer, her movements gliding, unnatural. Her hollow gaze bore into him as her bell rang again. Ding! Thomas's cries were swallowed by the sound. His thoughts turned to static, his strength draining from his limbs. "Yule Bride, you followed my bells and now you're mine." Her skeletal hand reached toward him. The next morning, Christmas dawned crisp and clear. The village was still, wrapped in snow that glistened under the winter sun. When the Whitakers awoke, Thomas's bed was empty. The search parties found nothing. No footprints, no clues. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The villagers said little, but they knew. Those who followed the bells were never found. For years after, on Christmas Eve, the villagers swore they could hear a second bell ringing through the woods, softer but unmistakable. Joined now by the sound of a young boy's voice calling faintly for help, lost forever in the snow. And if you listen closely on a still winter night, you'll hear them both, the bride and her bell, forever searching for those who don't heed the warning.